Look at your hand. Really look at it. The color of your skin, the tone, the shade, you probably think of it as just part of who you are. But what if it was never about identity at all? What if it was always just a survival tool your ancestors couldn't live without? The real answer to where humans came from and why we look so different today is far stranger than anything you were taught in school. Your story begins in Africa, not in a metaphorical sense, not as a political statement, as a biological fact. Every single human alive on Earth right now traces their ancestry back to the same small population of people who lived on the African continent. Scientists call this the out of Africa hypothesis, but calling it a hypothesis undersells it. The genetic evidence is overwhelming. The fossil record confirms it. You are African. Your great-great-grandmother, multiplied back 100,000 years, looked nothing like you, and she almost certainly had dark skin. Here is something that stops most people. When you imagine the first humans, you might picture something ancient and alien. But Homo sapiens, anatomically modern humans, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. That is the finding from the Jebel Irhoud fossil site in Morocco, where paleoanthropologist Jean-Jacques Hublin and his team discovered skulls that reshaped the timeline of human origins. 300,000 years of fully modern humans, thinking, feeling, solving problems. And for most of that time, there was only one population, living in one part of the world. Now here is where the story gets complicated and interesting. Around 60,000 to 70,000 years ago, a small group of humans did something that changed everything. They left, pushed out by climate shifts, drawn by curiosity, or forced by competition. No one knows exactly why, but a relatively tiny band of people crossed out of Africa and began spreading across the planet. Geneticist Spencer Wells, who led the Genographic Project, mapped this migration using DNA markers. What he found was that all non-African people alive today descend from that single founding population. A group so small, it would barely fill a high school auditorium. Let that sit for a moment. Every European, every East Asian, every indigenous American, every Pacific Islander, all of them descended from one group of Africans who wandered out of the continent tens of thousands of years ago. The genetic diversity you see in Africa today dwarfs the diversity in the rest of the world combined, because African populations had 300,000 years to diversify. Everyone else is working with a much narrower genetic starting point. So where did all the different appearances come from? This is where your biology becomes a story about the sun. The human body has a complicated relationship with ultraviolet radiation. UV light from the sun does two very important things. It destroys folate, a B vitamin your body needs to build DNA and support healthy pregnancies. And it triggers the production of vitamin D, which your immune system, your bones, and your hormonal health all depend on. These two pressures pull in opposite directions. Too much UV and you lose folate. Too little UV and you don't make enough vitamin D. Dark skin is rich in melanin, a pigment that acts as a natural sunscreen. It blocks UV radiation before it penetrates the deeper layers of skin. In equatorial Africa, where UV levels are intense year-round, dark skin is a survival advantage. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski at Penn State University spent years mapping this relationship between UV radiation and skin color across the globe. What she found was striking. Skin color doesn't follow national borders or ethnic categories. It follows sunlight. As ancient human populations migrated north into Europe and Asia, where UV levels dropped dramatically, especially in winter, lighter skin became an advantage. Lighter skin allows more UV through, producing enough vitamin D even in low-light environments. Your skin tone is not a cultural artifact. It is a latitude adapter. But here is what most people never hear. This change in skin color happened surprisingly fast in evolutionary terms. Geneticist Svante Paabo, who pioneered the field of ancient DNA analysis, has helped piece together timelines from ancient genomes. The data suggests that the ancestors of modern Europeans had dark skin until roughly 8,000 years ago. 8,000 years. That is a blink of evolutionary time. Agriculture had already existed for thousands of years. Humans were building settlements, trading, farming, And the people who would eventually become white-skinned Europeans still looked, by today's standards, like they came from sub-Saharan Africa. This is not fringe science. This is what the ancient DNA tells us directly. What drove the rapid shift? Likely a combination of factors. Agriculture changed diets, reducing the amount of vitamin D people got from fatty fish and organ meats. Populations living at high latitudes during long winters faced severe vitamin D deficiency. Lighter skin became not just useful, but necessary for survival and reproduction. Natural selection, operating over a few thousand generations, did the rest. And that is what makes race, as a concept, so scientifically fragile. The physical traits people have used to divide humanity, skin color, eye shape, hair texture, are mostly recent, mostly superficial, and mostly driven by local environmental pressures. They tell you very little about the deeper biology underneath. Your blood type has nothing to do with your skin color. Your disease susceptibilities, your cognitive patterns, your emotional architecture, these are shared across all populations far more than they differ. Geneticist Richard Lewontin demonstrated in 1972 that the vast majority of human genetic variation, around 85%, exists within populations, not between them. Two people from the same so-called racial group can be more genetically different from each other than either is from someone on the opposite side of the world. The categories that feel so solid, so obvious, so ancient, they are, genetically speaking, almost meaningless. What you are, at the deepest level, is a member of a single species that migrated out of one continent and adapted to every environment it encountered. Your ancestors were resourceful enough to survive the Sahara, the Arctic tundra, the Himalayan plateau, the Pacific Islands. They changed their bodies to fit each new world. They changed their skin, their eyes, their metabolism, their lactose tolerance. They did whatever they had to do to survive. And then, about 10,000 years ago, some of those populations started farming. They settled. They built walls. They drew borders. They started telling stories about who belonged inside and who didn't. And somewhere in that process, the biological reality that you are all one family that split up and wandered the earth got buried under centuries of mythology, politics, and fear. Science keeps digging it back up. Every ancient genome that gets sequenced tells the same story. Every migration map, every haplogroup chart, every comparison of ancient DNA to modern populations points in the same direction. The people you think of as fundamentally different from you share, on average, 99.9% of their DNA with you. The 0.1% includes things like whether you can digest milk as an adult and how much melanin your skin produces. That is what the differences are made of. So look at your hand again. That color, that tone, it is not a tribal marker. It is not a destiny. It is a record of where your ancestors stood, thousands of years ago, under a particular patch of sky, surviving a particular intensity of sunlight. It is adaptive brilliance encoded in your skin. You carry Africa in your genome, no matter what you look like. Every human does. The first mother, the first father, the founding population that gave rise to all of this, they are inside you right now, in sequences of DNA that have been passed down, unbroken, for 300,000 years. Tonight, when you look at someone who looks different from you, you are not looking at a stranger. You are looking at a cousin who took a different road out of the same home.